because we were both here in Georgia, I think maybe we had more of an interest in Doc's southern roots than other writers might have done. In fact, when my book first went to a publisher, they wanted to know why I didn't just start with when he met Wyatt Earp out west. I thought, well, then I've missed half the story. Your book begins with Child of the Southern Frontier, and my first book is Southern Son. So both of them set in Georgia when John Henry Holliday has no idea what his life is going to do with him. And they begin with his Southern heritage. Why is understanding, well, first, what was his Southern heritage, and why was his Southern heritage so important to telling his story?
Well, you know, the South has its myth in the same way that the West has its myth. And but there is underneath all of that a certain the part of Georgia that Doc spent his young years in was less of the Gone with the Wind South.
Right, it wasn't plantation
it
South.
It wasn't plantation.
Neither place that he lived.
That's
Griffin
right.
was not. Griffin was a small city that was a cotton shipping point, but it was a city south of Atlanta. And then he spent the other half of his life way down in the wiregrass wilderness.
His father was around as early as the Cherokee removal. You know, so the Indians had just been removed from Georgia a couple of decades before Doc was born. And so that's when the land around Griffin opened up, is because the settlers came in and took over what had been Cherokee and in southern Georgia Creek lands.
Right, and one treaty after another that opened up all of those lands to the white settlers.
But it was Southerners. It's an old book, and a lot of people don't like it, but there's a book called The Mind of the South, W.J. Cash. And I always found that book to be helpful because he was trying to help people to understand the way Southerners viewed the world. And in that, it was, we're talking about all the issues, the political differences, but there was a sense of community in the South that is somewhat difficult to explain. When one thinks of the South, most people think of the South, they think of a very rigid social structure in terms of the aristocrats at the top, and then the middling people, and then the poor people, and so forth, and then of course eventually all the way down to slaves. But that would be fairly accurate for a certain point, part of, let's say, Virginia, and along coastal Carolinas and coastal Georgia. There was the old long.
The colonial parts of the country. But this was
but that's a different kind of land and everything. And you know the cotton that was grown in the coastal Georgia was had a long fiber, and but that also had a different kind of soil, and so is this. As this movement moves into the interior, they get away from that sand, some of the soil down there.
Well, you mentioned the Creek Indians, the natives of this area. This was frontier. The inner parts of Georgia, where Doc Holliday was raised, it had all originally been a wilderness with Native Americans and a frontier land. So in some ways, it was more like the Wild West than it was like the cultured colonial.
It had a recent frontier background. Right. But one of the things that happened when we got into the red clay area of Georgia, up in the north of Macon and up in that area that became the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, that depended on a different kind of cotton entirely, and so it would not have been developed more than likely if it hadn't been for the invention of the cotton gin.
Right. So it's a different kind of culture.
So a different kind of
economy.
thing. But one of the things that happened in that part of Georgia is that while some people put on aristocratic airs, they were not people with long histories of heritage within particular families. Now there were a few, like the Clouds,
Right.
that were
Who was Jane, Alice Jane Mackey, John Henry's mother. That was her kin.
Yes.
The Clouds who owned Stone Mountain at one time were part of Stone Mountain.
Yeah.
But the story that we've heard that John Henry grew up a Southern aristocrat, there was not an aristocracy here.
No,
he wasn't part of that.
He was a part of the middling class.
Right.
But Cash points out in his book that in an odd and kind of perverse sort of way, slavery served as a leveler in white society, so that there was less class awareness between the aristocrats, a lot of whom had calluses under their white gloves from their simple roots and developing up and that, you know, of course there was what was always referred to as the poor white trash and that thing, but there was nothing that in most of Georgia that would keep anybody from having ambitions.
Right.
So that within the white communities, if a poor man was working hard and he had respect and honor for others and treated them with respect, and he had courage and honesty and those qualities, then essentially there wasn't as kind of this strict class structure.
Right. Well, and you see that in Holliday's family. His own father had various different jobs. He worked with a pharmacy at one time. He had land holdings. His uncle was a medical doctor. His grandfather on one side was a plantation owner up in the Henry County area, and his other grandfather owned a tavern on a major road in that part of Georgia. So, and people have asked me in the past, where did Doc Holliday learn to play cards? And Grandpa's Tavern. So you're right. It was a much more fluid situation. So Holliday's not a Southern aristocrat.
No.
But what are the elements of a Southern life that are? You mentioned one. I think the family structure was huge in the South, and
Yes.
so the loyalty to your family.
Loyalty to family was high.
So what are some of the other elements of Southern life that were important to the creation of his character?
Well, this was shared more broadly than just Georgia, I think, but there was this sense of honor.
Yes, Southern Honor.
Southern
one
honor.
of the classic books.
Yes, and this was defined really how you were supposed to relate to other people, how you were supposed to treat them, how you were supposed to deal with insults and injuries.
And so his Southern mannerliness that we hear about, it's not an affectation. It's not about the manners. It's about your honor and a training in how to deal with people.
Yes.
Not just put on airs.
And he did have the advantage of his mother having a little bit of that aristocratic.
Because it was her family
because
that
was her family
had the plantation.
And that had a significant influence, I think, on the way that Doc was raised. He was brought up not only learning what was manly, but he was also grew up learning social graces and the honor system.
Right. So, which is one of the things that makes him stick out in the Wild West. One of the reasons people, in everything ever written about him through the newspapers in the West, they always mentioned where he was from. He was different. He's one of, I think it's the thing that makes him really the most interesting character there, because he doesn't fit with everything else that's there. He really fit with here.